I dare say more of us probably know more about Ghana and Senegal and South Africa than we do about Liberia. Now, many folks may not realize that Liberia was founded by former enslaved folks here in the United States. Let's now talk with Claude Clegg. He is the chair of the Department of African and African American Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He also has written a book on Liberia. That book, folks, go ahead and pull it up right there. You see it right there. And so, and I have that book. I'm reading it right now. Claude, glad to have you here. The book is called The Price of Liberty, African Americans and the Making of Liberia. To that point I open with, it is interesting when we talk about, when African Americans talk about African nations, very few people bring Liberia up.
That's exactly right. Because as you were saying, Roland, so few have ever heard of it. We're a country that prides ourselves on being a nation of immigrants. That is, people coming to the United States for opportunity and freedom and liberties they can't enjoy in their homelands. And we're, I think, less comfortable in regard to our national mythologies of thinking of the United States as a place where people flee from. And there's a whole history, a whole genealogy of African Americans who leave the United States during the 19th century, the 1800s, and go to this little colony that becomes a nation on the West African coast because they weren't allowed to enjoy the benefits of the freedoms and the liberties and the rights that other Americans enjoy because, they were Americans. So I think within our way of thinking about the United States, if you leave the United States, you sort of fall out of American history.
Right.
We're not so concerned with you or whatever happens and wherever you go. Again, and that narrative doesn't fit well with our own sort of conception of this being a place everybody wants to come to.
But Claude, that was this weird. But I'm reading and I'm looking at all of this history, and that was this weird thing that came together that created this. So you had these white folks who believed in abolition. Then you had these white folks who feared black folk were going to kill them. And then you had the freed slaves, and they all created this colonization society to ship some 88 folks away, bought the land in Liberia. So take people through that, how this even happened, how we even got to this point of these first 88 leaving the United States and going back to Africa.
Great question. It's a kind of perfect storm in which you have abolitionists, people who are against slavery. You have slaveholders. You have people who couldn't stand free black folks. That is, if black people are going to be in this part of the world, they need to be in chains. And if by some method, whether they were freed by their masters or whoever, we need to get rid of them because we don't want them increasing the free black population. So it's kind of a perfect storm. And thus there were different motives. The abolitionists who were involved thought that slavery was wrong. And if black people couldn't be free in this country, we'd send them elsewhere where they could be free there. And then the slaveholders who were in this organization thought that if we can reduce the number of free blacks in this country, it makes slavery more secure. That is, slaves don't see the free blacks and thus aspire to be free themselves. And then there were the ex-slaves who we have the least amount of information about, although there's some letters and things that have been restored or preserved. But we have the least amount in regard to their opinions about why they would want to go to this part of the world in West Africa when the vast majority of black people by the early 1800s were born in this country. They weren't born in Africa. Africa was a secondhand memory or something Grandpa talked about, because he was from Africa. But most African Americans by the early 1800s are not born in Africa. So it is literally an experiment, and it's an experiment with different parties, with different interests and different views, and often contradictory.
So this group of white folks, they sail to Africa, they roll up to West Africa, and then we're going to acquire this land, buy it, drop them off, here you go, your country, named it Liberia, but it was people who were already living there. So now you have these freed folks of African descent returning back to Africa, but they didn't have any ties to Africa. And so now you got your indigenous folk who are like, who the hell are these people taking over our country? So freed slaves became colonizers.
Right. That is the irony of the whole Liberian experiment. That is, you have people in this country who are being sent to Africa, black people being sent to Africa to establish this colony in Liberia and so forth, and they take all that cultural baggage with them that they had acquired here in the United States. They take color prejudices, they take their Christianity and the readiness to label anybody not a Christian that they run into in Africa as a heathen or a savage. They take the clothes, the foodways, they take the language. The dollar is the official currency of Liberia.
They take the hierarchy.
And they take that. They take that as well. So they are reinventing a kind of America that they were familiar with in this country, the hierarchy, the colorism, the arrogance, the cultural arrogance, and they are reinventing it to a certain extent on the shores of West Africa with the same sort of hierarchies and exclusionary policies directed towards indigenous people. So it is a kind of black colonialism that's going on, in which you have a very small privileged class of black migrants from the United States ruling over a much larger population of indigenous people.
See, I know we're right on this because I'm looking at all of these people in the chat rooms who are like, yo, I ain't never heard any of this stuff. I'm going to go to my panel with questions. I'm going to start with Omekongo, you're first.
First of all, Professor Clegg, it's an honor to talk to you, and the work that you've been doing is just really, really amazing in terms of documenting this history. I would like to know, what is the status today of Americo-Liberians with the greater Liberian population?
That's a great question. Of course, as some of your listeners may know, there was a civil war in Liberia that was started in 1980, and it lasted on and off for about 2 decades. And more or less, it was the whole conflict between indigenous people and the descendants of the settlers coming to a head. And you have the government there in Liberia that was the descendants of the settlers from the United States being overthrown in 1980 and it becoming a military dictatorship under indigenous military officers. And then sort of back and forth of civil war for the next 2 decades.
So Claude, hold on. I want to put a pin in that because
sure.
So to explain to people, to Omekongo's question. So from that point of 1822 all the way through, it was the people who were running the country, the elite of Liberia, were the descendants of these freed slaves in America. And I was reading, so some of them were called Americo-Liberians. Also, what was the phrasing? They call them the Congo. It was an interesting phrase as well. So explain that as well, because people don't understand that the black folks who came from here were running the country all those years. So when they had the war, they were trying to break that black American colonization.
Yes, that's exactly right. This experiment lasted much longer than a lot of people would have thought it was going to last. And from 1822, when the first ships were going over by under the American Colonization Society, that group of abolitionists and slaveholders and others who put this together, up to 1980, which is in the lifetime of a lot of folks. This sort of small strata of Black American descendants who originally got there in the 1800s, all the way up to 1980, ran the place. And mostly it was excluding the African population there from civic life, from holding office, from the economic affairs, and so forth. And as we know, if we study any history, this sort of thing in which you have a minority ruling over a much larger majority can't go on forever. And it explodes. in 1980, and to very deadly consequences for a lot of folks who have a Liberian diaspora leaving that country. There's a brain drain to a certain degree as well. You have people going into other countries, and a good number of people who come here who can afford it. And actually, there's a sort of reverse migration. So the descendants of a lot of the folks who had first gone there in the 1800s, their descendants are now fleeing from Liberia to come back or come to America in the wake of that Civil War in the 1980s. So some of that remnant of the descendants of the Black settlers who went there in the 1800s, they got a foothold in government, and some never lost it. But I think that Liberia is probably, in terms of social integration, further along in that is integrating the settler elites, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, with a larger African majority. They're probably more along the path of that, but still, you can still find some of those old settler names in positions of power, in which, again, these elites often reproduce themselves as best they can, even in the worst of circumstances. So we'll have to see. Liberia is an ongoing puzzle. It's an ongoing project. While you don't see African Americans going there to settle or anything like that, you still see those linkages of Liberians who are embracing this country as, the great grandfather or the father of Liberian society. And when something bad happens, there's an awful Ebola outbreak there in 2014. And of course, you have twin things happening. This idea of America is going to step up when there's problems in its grandchild, Liberia, on the coast, and then you have a Black president in Barack Obama. So not only does America owe us because they sent us here and sent our ancestors here and so forth as settlers, but you have this Black president who also owes as well. So again, I've looked at Liberia for the last couple of decades with much interest. It's an ongoing story. It has many of the same problems as many other African countries in terms of poverty and social divisions and hierarchies of all sorts and exclusion and so forth. So I'm wishing the Liberian people the best, all of them. But again, you can still sort of see those lines of privilege and those genealogy, those names still threaded through the various institutions there.
Julian Melvo.
Brother Professor, thank you for your work. I'm looking forward to getting your book. Years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who at that time had just been elected president. And the one thing she asked, a bunch of us sisters asked her, what can we do? And she talked about girls' education, about the education system being crumbling, but that girls were having a much more difficult time. Has that changed? Has the educational system improved? And are women and girls getting equal access to education?
I wish I had a better story to report in terms of education more generally in Liberia and women's education as well. But my sense is that there hasn't been anything in terms of transformative changes. I think it mattered that Liberia had a female president for a number of years who did a credible job in the position. It was the first in the history of that country. And I think it was first on the continent.
Yeah, she was the first female. She's the first female head of state of any African nation.
Yes. So I think she did a credible job. I had the pleasure of meeting her a number of years ago, and she directed that same question to me. Actually, her question was, "What can you do, Professor Clegg, for Liberia?" And I, it caught me off guard, but I think it was the exact right question for her to ask. I think that Liberia is still recovering from those decades of civil war, largely on its own. There's been, on and off American assistance and so forth. But you can't have, 2 decades of neglect and, a civil war that goes on for a couple of decades. And then more neglect on top of that and catastrophes. It reminds me much of what happened in Haiti. And the French, the sort of neglect that the French imposed upon that country. It's the same sort of, if ever people deserve the break, the Haitian people deserve it. And I would say right behind them, the Liberian people. So, unfortunately, I don't have a good report in regard to the status of women in Liberia. I don't think it's appreciably better in terms of education and opportunity than it was 20 years ago.
Lauren.
Yes, Doctor. If there was one thing that you'd want people to know about Liberia, what would it be?
I would want people to know. Wow, that's a great question. I'd want them to know a lot of things about it. I'd want them to know how the society, why it was created. It was created by, of course, there were indigenous people always there, and it wasn't the case, that Liberia was simply discovered. There was always people there, and they had communities, and they had government structures, and they had economies, and they had trade networks, and so forth. But the thing that drove the folks here in the United States there, their national slogan, the love of liberty brought us here. And what people are prepared to do to get themselves out of a bad situation. Again, it wasn't the case that these Black Americans in this country were returning to Liberia. Most of them had not been born there. They were Americans. They were born here. They just couldn't enjoy the fruits of American citizenship. So they were stepping out on faith. That is, Black folks in the 19th century knew the Atlantic Ocean as a graveyard for Black folks. There are many, 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 many more times the number of Black people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean westward into slavery than there were those few trickle eastward into liberty in a place like Liberia. So to step out into the Atlantic Ocean, into that world, more or less putting your faith in white people, in their ships and things, and hoping that they would land you in free Liberia, just goes to show what people were prepared to do in the name of trying to live in this world in some dignified existence for themselves and their children. So I'm sympathetic for those settlers. I'm not sympathetic for the kind of society that the sort of settler colony, settler colonialism that they imposed there. But in regard to the aspiration to be something more than American slaves, I'm sympathetic to, again, I think it was a failure of imagination on the part of those settlers who would go there and reinvent what they had known in America with all the oppression and the exclusion and so forth. A failure of imagination that reaches this conclusion in that coup that takes place in 1980. But Liberia, I think, is a reminder of what people are prepared to do to improve their situations, even if it means stepping a world away across an ocean to do so.
Last point I want to make here before we go. This is their flag. You want to talk about those American roots? It literally is based upon the United States flag. That's the Liberian flag right there. Also, there was a long period where Liberia was the envy of many African nations in terms of when William Tubman was president, the economy, roads, things along those lines. And so what's unfortunate is that this was a country that was further along economically than many other African nations. Many of those African nations started getting their independence. Obviously, Ghana was the first one. And then, of course, 1959, 1960, it began to spread all across the continent. But it was that war in 1980 that actually destroyed, in many ways, all of those decades of economic progress and set the nation back. Imagine where, and look, obviously, they had to deal with that whole, American descendant ruling class. But where would Liberia be if they did not have that 2-decade civil war that went on?
That's a great question. We historians, sometimes we have trouble with those kind of what if counterfactual scenarios. That what would have happened if, and our crystal balls tend not to be as any better than others. But I think that there were a number of things broken with Liberia, even in its sort of heyday under Tubman, its former president, right before Tobert, the one that got overthrown and actually killed in the coup in 1980. You had a settler elite that was based on a house of cards. So you have a 7% of the population ruling the other 90+%. That's just a recipe for something going wrong, especially if you're trying to control and run those 90% on your own terms and excluding them from the levers of power, political representation, roles in the economy, and imposing your own sort of cultural vision on what they they should be. So I think that during this period that you're mentioning, Roland, yeah, Liberia, many of us looked at this stable model of democracy and constitutional governance and so forth. But if you sort of peel back, the layers, and you don't have to peel back many, you'll see this much larger Black African population that it's excluded, and the power of the ruling elite, the settler elite there and their children, is based on the exploitation and sort of sitting on the necks of those indigenous people. Even as you're showing the world how civilized and how advanced you are, by more or less mimicking to a certain degree the United States and its constitution, its flag, its dollar, and so forth.
Will you be going there this year for the bicentennial?
I will not. I will not. I would love to. It's an important date, 1822, as you're mentioning it. But I will not be able to make it to that occasion.
Well, we'll be there. We'll be leaving here February 11th. We'll be there for a week. Our plan is to arrive. It's about a 25-hour flight. Arrive February 12th, February 13th. Leave on February 20th. Well, there's a huge celebration on February 14th. We're going to be live streaming events all week from Liberia. We've been communicating with the Liberian government, working with the ministers there about this. And, one of the things that I said to them, I said, let's just be clear, ABC, NBC, CBS, they ain't going to be caring about what happens in Liberia. But I do think it's important for us to be able to tell that story, what's going on, talking with folks there as well, because there still are opportunities. One of the things after Ella Johnson Sirleaf became president, Bob Johnson actually opened a luxury hotel there. You do have African Americans who are looking at investments in Liberia, just like you're seeing the same thing happen in other African countries like Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa. And so it's important for us to be able to tell that story to get to what's going on. Folks, Dr. Claude Clegg is the author of The Price of Liberty, African Americans and the Making of Liberia. We appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
A pleasure.
All right, folks, real quick break. We come back, our Fit, Live, Win segment. Normally we talk about working out and fitness, but your eye health is just as important as your physical health. You're watching Roland Martin Unfiltered right here on the Black Star Network.